Good morning, everyone. The Atlantic Council has moved to New York on the occasion of the United Nations General Assembly. We are live from the St. Regis Hotel. I am Rama, Yade, Senior Director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. This year, we'll start with agriculture in partnership with our dear friends of the Policy Center for the New South. Allow me to greet them as they are based in Morocco and facing a deadly earthquake. They are providing support to local populations. Agriculture should be at the heart of any development policy. It is one of Africa's most important economic sectors, accounting for 35% of the continent's GDP. In sub-Saharan Africa, it provides work for nearly 60% of the active population. Yet food insecurity has increased as a result of the war in Ukraine and as the prices of food and production surge, not to mention the extreme weather conditions, which when combined with weak local infrastructure and the lowest levels of productivity pose an additional risk to Africa's ability to meet its food needs and objectives. This situation is very difficult to understand because Africa accounts for 60% of the world's untapped arable land in the world, so the continent could feed itself, not only itself, but also the entire world. Beyond emergency measures or short-term policies, that seek to address food insecurity, I think it's before all about food sovereignty for the African continent that is at stake here. That is why today the Atlantic Council and the Policy Center for the New South will release together a report on agritech authored by our two senior fellows, Aubrey Houbi and Fatima Ezara Mengoub. In 20 minutes, they will share their recommendations with you and the panelists we have invited to discuss with them. Before that, it's my pleasure to launch this unique high-level conversation featuring His Excellency Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki, African Union Special Envoy for Food Systems, former Prime Minister of Niger, and Dr. Kari Fowler, US Special Envoy for Global Food Security. Access to land, infrastructure, inclusivity, training, the urban challenge, access to capital and to global markets, certification, productivity. There's a lot to discuss when it comes to food security and food sovereignty. We'll discuss these various dimensions of this critical topic together. Dr. Mayaki, Dr. Fowler, welcome to the Atlantic Council.
Thank you.
I will start with you, Mr. Prime Minister Mayaki. In June 2022, in Sochi, Vladimir Putin and Macky Sall, with his hat of chair of the African Union, decided to meet to discuss about the food insecurity created by the war in Ukraine. 1 year later, this very Vladimir Putin decided to withdraw from the Black Sea grain deal that ensured the safe export of Ukrainian grains. Very recently, a few weeks ago in Johannesburg, the president of Russia promised grain shipments to 6 African countries. So as African Union Special Envoy on food security, how do you appreciate these geopolitical moves? Yeah. And we know that you have been appointed in the framework of the Working Group on Food by the African Union. What is your opinion about this geopolitical situation?
First of all, thank you really for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor. And thanks to the Atlantic Council and the Policy Center of the New South. 3 quick issues. The first one, the African Union thought necessary to engage with Russia and Ukraine, by the way, in order to find a feasible solution to that blockage in terms of grain. It was a decision of the African Union. African Union has a Bureau of Heads of States, etc. So in terms of processes, it was very well managed. Now, the objective was double at the two aspects. On the one hand, there was the diplomatic consideration, and as you know, the African Union proposed the peace plan. And on the other way, there was this response to a request from certain member states of the African Union, especially in North Africa, because most of the wheat Africa imports is imported by North Africa. So it was a response also to a request from the North African states to find a solution. It has not been going very well. I think we see the results from now. But what is also interesting is that the solution that came out, whatever the limits were, benefited much more the Europeans than the Africans. Because we got, I mean, a very little percentage of the grains that were supposed to come to Africa. Now, my second point is that this demonstrated to us, as it did demonstrate during the COVID time, but it's important for Africa to count on itself with its own defined position first, and then partner in order to support the position that it defines. During the COVID time, this is what happened. We had to very quickly think in terms of protective equipments, etc., organize a regional response, and because we didn't have a global response. I think it's a lesson. The lesson that we drew from the COVID, we applied it to food systems. And what is our objective now is really to reduce our food import bill, which is, according to FAO, over $60 billion. These $60 billion come out of African ordinary citizen pockets. So if we could invest them better in our agricultural policies, which have been adopted continentally, it would help increase production and productivity. So food sovereignty, even though is a concept which is relatively discussed and not unanimously approved, it is a political gesture in order to push towards lesser food insecurity by making sure that agriculture, in the wide sense of the term, is looked at as a priority to reduce poverty, and at the same time to create wealth, because the idea in reducing poverty and creating wealth is to work fundamentally with small-scale farmers who produce 80% of the food we eat. So if we could empower them to become micro, meso entrepreneurs, I think it would be a huge boost. And this is one of the tasks that will be consubstantial with the objective of attaining food sovereignty.
So to do that, you need your partners, right? And that's why I mentioned so heavily the Russian influence on this space. There's also another global actor represented here by Dr. Fowler, who is this U.S. Special Envoy on food security. Let me just ask you one question, Dr. Fowler, to start with you. A few months ago, in December 2022, Washington welcomed the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, for the first in 8 years. A lot of expectations around this food security matter. In January 2023, I think a few weeks later, the U.S. administration launched the VAX. Can you tell us more about VAX, the key word to explain to reach what goals when it comes to food security?
Sure. Thank you very much. And Ambassador, thank you and the Atlantic Council for convening this meeting. we very much welcome the report that you're going to release a little bit later today, I believe, Unlocking Africa's Agricultural Potential. I don't want to steal the spotlight from the authors of that report, but I'll just say I read it last night, and it's polite for me to praise it, but I'll go beyond that and say that this is a really important report that everyone here should read. You will both learn a number of things that will surprise you, and it'll cause you to think.
And the report
give
is
you new
available
ideas.
online on the Atlantic Council's website.
Yep. So my compliments. We're very pleased to be working with Dr. Mayaki. The remarks he just made will give you some indication of what it's like to work with him. And in fact, we just came from a meeting, Dr. Mayaki and I, where we were talking about the follow-up to the African Leaders Summit from last year. One of the things that we did as a result of that was to look very closely at the African Union Common Position on Food Systems, and we also were anticipating an African Summit on Fertilizer and Soil Health, which will be held later this year in November in Africa. We at the State Department were particularly interested in what are we overlooking? What are the things that are really important that need to be done that maybe we're not giving enough emphasis to? The United States is the largest donor to humanitarian food security programs. We're also the largest donor to building food security, sustainable food security in Africa. We know that. But what could we be doing better? What have we overlooked? What could we be doing more of? And I think when we thought about that question, we realized that we needed to think more seriously about how do we build nutrition in food systems in Africa in a sustainable way that's consistent with the kind of constraints that are going to be put on our food systems by climate change. So we are in the midst of co-sponsoring a large initiative with the African Union, with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, where we'll do three things. One is to identify the crops in Africa, traditional and indigenous crops, that have the most potential for adding nutrition to diets in Africa. It's not simply a question of building calories, putting calories in people's stomachs.
So you have to map the situation on the ground, and you do that with the African Union?
We're doing that with the African Union. We held our first meeting to identify those priority crops, chaired by the head of the African Nutrition Society. This will be an African-led initiative, and then we'll assess how those crops will do in a climate-changed world. And on the basis of knowing which crops can add the most for nutrition in Africa and which will do the best in climate change, we'll have the basis for making rational investments in plant improvement work. And that in turn will be embedded in the African countries through national programs and the plant breeders that already exist in Africa.
So the VAX is the Division for Adapted Crops and Soils. I have a question for you, Dr. Mayaki, about the long-term solutions, because we understand the importance to provide assistance because there is some geopolitical crisis in the world, fine, but we know that it's very important to build an industry also in agriculture. So what are your most important recommendations for supply chains, manufacturing, all these tools so critical when it comes to building an industry in agriculture?
Thank you. Before answering to a question, I would like to mention the importance of soil and the fact you referred to about 60% of arable land. It is true we flag this figure frequently, but this 60% has to be relativized, taking into account the health of the soils, which knows a certain dimension of degradation. Three main priorities. Africa, regarding the long term. By 2050, in the low scenarios case, we will double our population from 1.3 to roughly 2.5, 2.6. if our capacity to feed 1.3 is weak, how are we going to do with 2.6?
Maybe
so
more.
that's maybe more. So that's my first occupation, what we are working on in terms of prospective analysis. Because if we make the right prospective analysis, we can go back and look at the tools we use today, CADEP, Malabo, national pathways coming out of UN for Systems Summit, the multisectorality of the agricultural policies, because we tended to look at them in a monosectoral way, and agriculture is really multisectoral. So one important fact when we will have to face this challenge is to think in terms of integrating agricultural issues, trade issues, and infrastructure issues. We will not be able to feed 2.x billion Africans if we do not think holistically. And this has to be done on a regional basis. That's my second point. The main obstacle to Africa's development is its fragmentation in 50 plus countries. Optimality is at regional level, not at national level. So we must push for regional policies in agriculture, in trade, and in infrastructure, so that we can constitute food baskets with comparative advantages and have these food baskets specialized in certain crops, be able to pave the way for an increase in intra-African trade.
55 countries, you're right, we cannot have a Pan-African approach here. So for our audience, how do you map the situation? What are the main regions, areas in Africa in terms of agriculture? What are the differences, the strengths? What is the situation of agriculture in Africa? What are the strengths?
You can say roughly, I don't have time to go into the details, but roughly, North Africa is more oriented towards wheat, citrus fruits exported to Europe. West Africa is more oriented toward rice. I'm giving the big crops. And Southern Africa more oriented toward maize, etc. So if we build regional food baskets, by increasing within these food baskets production and productivity, we will be able to feed 2.x billion. But we need to resolve that fragmentation dimension, and we need to have regional policies. Yeah. And the third point is about investment. I think if we deep dive into the conception and the details of these food baskets, then we can show to potential investors where they can invest in agri, in infrastructure, taken into account, but evidently we need to do our homework in terms of policy reform, etc.
Dr. Fowler, since you read Aubrey and Fatima's report on agritech, which is agritech is one of the solutions they mention for the long-term African food sovereignty. What do you believe in this agritech solution? And among the recommendations, which one seems the most relevant to you? What about the Indian model, for example, that seems an important role model for the global south these days?
Well, I'll start by just picking up on something that Dr. Mayaki mentioned there and adding to it. He and I work closely together. We've known each other for some years. We're, I think, always been aligned. And one of the things that's important with our work with Africa is to focus on the smallholder farmer. There's no alternative that's going to leapfrog over that. It's also to focus on women farmers, and in particular, they account for most of the production in Africa. What I took from, and I'm grateful to Dr. Mayaki for mentioning soil health and fertility. There's no such thing as food security in a land where the soil is degraded or eroded, or where the crops are unadapted to climate change. So we can talk all we want about everything, every other aspect of the food system, but unless we begin to start building the soils and adapting the crops, we're going to run into real trouble. What I really loved about the report that you mentioned is that it gives hope. There were some concrete examples of small-scale businesses that are providing information and services to farmers that you can simply read that report and instinctively know, well, yes, that will work. What we in the U.S. government want to do is to add to that and to help make those kind of efforts more successful. So one of the things that we're doing on the soil front, for example, is to promote much more soil mapping in Africa and much more analytical work, modeling, so that the farmers in Africa, which more than any farmers anywhere else in the world, need precision agriculture. That's a term you generally apply to the United States, where you know the difference between this little plot of soil and 1 meter away and can treat the soil differently. If there's any place in the world that needs that type of knowledge and application, it's among smallholders in Africa. And I think that's the direction we're going, to try to provide that type of actionable information to help small farmers manage their farms and their soil in a better way to promote production and sustainability. And looking at some of the examples in your report, I can see how we can marry what we're doing with some of the work that is highlighted in that report and make both efforts more productive.
You too mentioned the importance of healthy lands and soils to reach the goals we share. Dr. Mayaki, what is your appreciation of these international gatherings on climate issues? Is the agriculture sector taken into consideration by these global conversations? And when I mention these gatherings, I think of the recent Nairobi first climate summit, and maybe in December, the next COP28 in Dubai. Is agriculture at the heart of the conversations, and how is it considered when it comes to combating climate change through agriculture?
This is a very important question, and I must say that the COP28 organized by UAE will be a turning point in all the COPs that have been organized before regarding food systems. It's the first time that we concretely see the organizers of a COP enhance the issue of agri-food systems. I'm part of a working group on climate and agri-food systems in preparation for the COP28. And in the declaration which is being prepared for the leaders, that will be mentioned quite significantly. So it's a turning point. COP28 is a turning point. All the other COPs didn't really highlight the importance of agri-food systems. And Africa finds itself very comfortable with that, because when we designed our common African position on food systems, the issues of climate came out very strongly. So we had started that thinking of the interlinkages between climate issues and agri-food system issues. I won't come back on the fact that we are the ones which are most affected by climate change on a world scale, and we are zero net emitters. So it's for us, adaptation, also mitigation, but adaptation will be critical. And the way it is framed, the way the preparations of a COP28 do integrate this aspect is for us extremely important. And then comes the issue of climate finance. And as you know, President Ruto, who is the chair of the Committee of African States, in charge of the climate, and the climate summit in Nairobi emphasized that. Climate finance will be a critical issue for us because we have been lagging behind.
Dr. Fowler, on this same topic, what is the U.S. strategy for in the next years when it comes to combining climate considerations and the food systems? Because the U.S. have an important role in defining the climate agenda on the global stage. And what do you plan to do for the next COP, and how do you work with President Ruto, who leads the African work on this topic?
Well, I think in terms of agriculture and food security, climate is really the central issue. And if you look out into the future, you'll see that there's a need to produce 50 to 60% more food in Africa by mid-century. But if you factor in the kind of hit that agriculture is going to take because of climate change, some of our major crops, in fact, projections are actually in the minus column for some of those crops, that the yield will be even smaller than it is today. So obviously we have a huge challenge. The reality is that neither agricultural systems nor economic development systems or approaches change overnight. We need time to make those changes, and this is what many governments aren't that great at, is making long-term plans and making long-term commitments.
And do you involve the U.S. private sector, like U.S. companies, as investors in this effort?
Yeah, absolutely, and I hear more and more about that every day, but I think we have to be in this for the long term. We're having great discussions with the African leaders, certainly with Dr. Mayaki on the follow-up to the African Leaders Summit. We want to make sustained commitments to building agricultural sustainability and food security in Africa.
My last question would be for you, Dr. Mayaki. You mentioned the Emirates. Land and water seem interesting to many regional powers from the Middle East, and they have a strong strategy to Africa, prioritizing the food systems and the lands. Do you share the fear of these Africans who think that the African Union should better protect the access to African lands and water for African populations? How do you appreciate this debate?
Yeah, I think the land tenure issues are very important. It's uneven in terms of quality of policies of land tenure in Africa, but there is a consensus on the necessity to protect the small-scale farmers. And as Dr. Fowler was mentioning today, women are the ones producing these 80% of the food we eat. So access to land, protection, and sound land tenure policies, which cannot be defined without the participation of the peasants and the small-scale farmers. So it's not a top-down issue, it's a top-down combined to bottom-up. So land will be essential. Water, some think that, Africa does not have a scarcity of water, but we are having a higher scarcity of water in a progressive manner, and this has to be managed. So the fundamental point is to think holistically, get agriculture out of a monosectoral issue, insert it in a broad spectrum of policies, and have the necessary political engagement to move in that direction in order not to face governance challenges by 2050.
Dr. Fowler, continuing our brief conversation around the U.S. private sector, can you detail more about the involvement of investors, private investors in African agriculture? Is it something? Is it an attractive sector for the U.S. companies who want to invest in Africa?
Well, it needs to be an attractive sector. And just last night, we unveiled a joint program that we will sponsor with the government of Norway to provide financing for small and medium-scale enterprises in Africa involved in agriculture to try to de-risk some of the risks that are inherently there. So I believe, and when I talk to different companies, frankly, they're looking for opportunities in Africa. I talk to grain companies, I talk to equipment manufacturers, to fertilizer companies. They're all looking for ways to do that. Yes, they want good business, but yes, they also want to serve the longer-term needs of developing agriculture in Africa. So I think there are a lot of opportunities. I think, again, I want to commend the report that the Atlantic Council did and urge everyone to go online and read it, because it will show a number of very specific opportunities that are available out there, and some new and surprising ones.
So speaking of the famous report, I would like to give the authors the possibility to present themselves the report now. And, but before that, I would like to thank you, Prime Minister Mayaki, Dr. Fowler, for accepting to join this fireside chat. It was a pleasure to have you at the Atlantic Council. And the best we can do is to wish you good luck for your critically important mission.
Thank you.
Last word from yourself?
First of all, let me reiterate my thanks, because it's an opportunity to present what we do and to also boost potential partnerships, looking at Africa in a positive narrative, because we are out of a negative narrative. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here.
Exactly.
Thank you very much again, really.
Thank you, Mr. Mayaki. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fowler.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's okay, we can manage. Well, thank you everyone for being such a patient and engaged audience. And thanks to our speakers. I think they really set the stage, and obviously I've been a big fan of Dr. Fowler's promoting of the report, so he's done a lot of my job already. But what I wanted to do is kind of begin a discussion on agritech in Africa and the potential for ag tech solutions to really increase productivity. And so let me just say a few words about the report, and I know we're going to be joined by one of my co-authors and one of our speakers from Morocco and from Nairobi accordingly. But let me just set a bit on the report. Unlike Latin America and Southeast Asia, African countries have seen a reduction in agricultural productivity since independence, and many have missed out on the green revolution that we saw in the first wave of improved seed varieties and fertilizer varieties that we saw all through Southeast Asia. And part of that is because of the structure of the sector, which I think we'll hear from both Niraj and Ellie later about smallholders. So you have intense informality in the space and fragmentation. So we're talking in the scale of hundreds of millions of smallholder farmers. And of course, that means that they're often operating at a suboptimal and an unproductive level. But we're not really making progress on this issue from a global community perspective. Despite all the activity, it was 50 years ago this year when McNamara, who was president of the World Bank at the time, sat in Nairobi and said, we really need to make progress on African agricultural productivity, and here we are 50 years later having that same discussion. But I do believe that there's kind of a game-changing opportunity right here, which is the digital revolution that's underway on the continent. So we're talking about nearly 700 million mobile subscribers and increased digitization as a result of COVID. And that alone will allow us to think about ways to utilize digital solutions to address the issues for African smallholders. So really this report digs in to looking at the ag tech companies, and we looked at ag tech companies across many emerging markets, so India, Brazil, Bangladesh, Vietnam, African countries. And what we found was that there are basically 4 business models that define ag tech across the world. And number 1 would be access to finance and to inputs. Number 2, an access to information. Number 3, an access to markets. And 4th, an access to a shared infrastructure or shared equipment. And so those 4 business models have defined ag tech operations and companies across the world, and that's true for Africa. And so then we took a look at the ag tech space in Africa and said, okay, how many companies are reaching scale? So we defined scale loosely and said we are looking for companies that have raised at least $5 million in their last round and have 50 employees. And we came up that there's 10 on the continent. And we're blessed on this panel to have the CEOs of 2 of those 10 to talk about the aspects that are needed for scale. And then we zoomed in on India and we said, okay, India has often been a good look into the future for African markets because it's a very large market at over 1 billion people. It's fragmented, it has a lot of the same issues, and it's a messy, large federal democracy, which is more applicable to many African countries than, say, a China. And we said, okay, what allowed Indian ag tech companies to scale? And we found that deep connectivity issue about digital backbone with the digital ID, with the reduction of the cost of data, which is my last report about critical connectivity in Africa. So these things are coming together. So it's with that, and later on I can talk about the recommendations we made in the report, but with that I want to jump in to the conversation. And I do hope we can get our friends on from the continent on the screens, but I assume they'll join when we figure out the tech. So digital solutions are our friends and our enemies. But I am so pleased to be joined on stage here by, oh, fantastic, Fatima, you're with us, welcome. Fatima is one of my co-authors on this report, and we have Ellie as well. So we do have our friends here. So on stage I have Cameron Alford, who's the Vice President of Compact Operations at MCC, Millennium Challenge Corporation, coming up from Washington with me. We have Niraj Varia, he's the CEO of Iprocure. We have Ellie. Ellie, I can't see you. I assume you can see us, but we can see you. And Ellie Polak is the CEO of Apollo. And Fatima and I work together. She's with the Policy Center of the New South on this report to really dig into some of the issues. So first, I kind of wanted to turn to Niraj and Ellie, first to say a little bit about the companies you've been building, and then to say what is the kind of infrastructure that's needed to allow for your scaling across the region. And what I will zoom in is you both have companies that have significant footprints in Kenya. And we did find that Kenya was a market leader for ag tech companies within Africa. And I think that comes down to M-Pesa and some of the digitization story that we saw in Kenya. So Niraj, I'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about what you're building and how you see scaling.
Sure. So the problem that we're trying to solve is actually, was spoken about on the previous panel, it's about fragmentation. There are hundreds of millions of farmers who don't have effective access to essential agricultural inputs, your seeds, your feeds, your fertilizers, and so on. And it's not so much that they don't need them. In many cases, they even know they need them, but the infrastructure, the supply chain to get it to them is utterly broken. And it's broken largely because, put simply, nobody knows anything about it. We're talking about millions of very small scale pen and paper retail stores. And if you're trying to get hundreds of millions of dollars of product out to hundreds of millions of farmers, trying to do that in a pen and paper ecosystem doesn't work. Right? These guys don't have access to working capital. frankly, they don't even know what they're selling and what their inventory is. And in a rain-fed environment, that means that in any particular month, you're expecting huge amounts of sales, but you don't know what to buy, when to buy it, and farmers miss out. So we were talking to the commercial lead of one of the largest seed manufacturers in the region, and he was saying that in the last rain season in Kenya alone, they were able to satisfy 30% of confirmed orders. So 70% of the farmers who knew they needed the seed did not get it because of lack of information. So what we do is we digitize those agri-dealers. So we've digitized 25% of all agri-dealers in Kenya, 10% of agri-dealers in Uganda. We upgrade them so that they now are able to make much better decisions, access working capital directly from us and from others. And by upgrading that entire layer and then providing that information to the manufacturers and the distributors, the entire supply chain is pushed up a notch.
And what is an agri-dealer?
So these are, great question, sorry. These are very small retail stores in a small town that sells, depends on where you are, but in Kenya you've got to be a qualified agronomist or a veterinarian that sells seeds, feeds, fertilizers. In Uganda it's a bit different. You've got to be a trained agronomist who's allowed to sell crop products, or a veterinarian who's allowed to sell veterinary products. Very, very tightly regulated. But essentially these are technical experts rather than business people who are running very informal stores. So that's what we do, and through the agri-dealers that we've digitized so far, those agri-dealers themselves serve just over 1 million farmers across the two countries, and expanding beyond that. Your question as to how do we achieve scale?
Yeah. Well, let's first hear Ellie and what you're building with Apollo, so we can see those two and how they fit, and then we'll talk a little bit more about scale.
Hey everyone, thanks Aubrey and thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting the event today. I'm Eli, I'm the founder and CEO of Apollo Agriculture. Our business is helping farmers make more money. The way we do that is we sell them products, so things like seed, fertilizer, crop protection. We offer them financing that enables them to invest up front and pay when they realize those significant returns at harvest. And we offer them digital advisory and access to market. So Aubrey, across those business models that you mentioned, we aim to provide everything a farmer needs to succeed from seed to sale. But before I founded Apollo with my co-founders Benjamin and Earl, I worked in agritech for a while in the US and helped build a company there that put digital advisory solutions on almost 80 million acres across the US. And when we founded Apollo, I think we initially assumed that we might take a similar path, digital advisory. But I think as we dug in more, what we noticed was that the reason farmers were producing far less than US farmers, between 10 and 20% of what US farmers, was because they lacked access to some of the fundamental tools that Niraj mentioned. So when a farmer accesses high quality seed, sufficient fertilizer, the advisory services they need to manage their farm well, and when the weather cooperates, there's every ability for them to produce as much as the farmer produces in the US or other regions of the world. But the challenge is that they lack access to those fundamental tools. And so we bring farmers everything they need to succeed from seed to sale. We provide them the financing that they need to invest, and then we support them as they manage those investments across the course of the season, and we share in that upside. We're operating in Kenya and Zambia, and we have around 300,000 customers across those two markets, who are all farmers who are partnering with Apollo to access the fundamental agricultural and financial services they need to invest, grow their agribusinesses, feed their families, feed their communities, and yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks for having me.
So on both those accounts, I mean, when we scanned and look at ag tech globally, it seems that all the kind of business models eventually arrive at providing credit in some way, shape, or form. Because when you say you sell to farmers, then or ag dealers, services, they need to be able to buy your services, and often they are out of the realm of the banking system, or at least not seen as creditworthy or unwilling to use their land as collateral, or all of these issues. So when getting to scale to the point where you are providing enough credit to farmers to be meaningful, what do you need? What do you need to get there? And what kind of partners, particularly in partnerships, US government-wise, are useful. And Niraj, maybe you have some views on that, and we'll come back to Eli, and then we'll hear from Cameron on things MCC are doing.
Yeah. The crucial point around scale is, first of all, absolutely the digital infrastructure. So our entire system, and Eli's as well, really works on the massive increase in mobile penetration, data penetration in particular. It's not strong, right? It's not going to work on an iPhone. And so we all have to really compress our services down to work on the data infrastructure of rural Africa. But that is massively improving, which is great. The second thing we need is all these things, the value at the moment, unfortunately, of a single smallholder farmer is pretty low to Apricure, to Apollo, to everybody. And so we need to drive the costs down, but also then accept the fact that our acquisition cost of each individual farmer or agro-dealer is going to have to be spread over a long period of time.
Because you're at the last mile, so last mile is always expensive.
Exactly. And so what is great, what's been essential for us is that we have actually gotten support from the US government to help finance the rollout of our system, taking us from 10% to 25% today of all agro-dealers in Kenya, and with a view to getting to about 50%. So that upfront capital injection and support is absolutely critical, because that's what makes the network effects kick in. Once we hit 25, 30% of all agro-dealers, to the point around credit, suddenly banks want to get involved and lend to the agro-dealers. The fintechs want to lend to the farmers and use our platform to control the use of the borrowing that they make. But we need to get to that effective density, which does require material upfront contribution.
And in the report, we found that there were some keys to scale. One being access to partnerships or ways that you can reduce that cost of customer acquisition. Secondly, and Eli, I want to come in on, is some access to affordable credit that you can on-lend. And I know that you have been working, and both of you have DFC-type relationships. So Eli, maybe you can speak to that as part of your scaling journey.
Thanks, Aubrey, and thanks, Niraj. I think this is all only interesting at scale. I mean, if you think about food security impact, you think about commercial opportunity, we've grown a lot as a business, but 300,000 farmers is a drop in the bucket. And so I think, thinking about how you get 3 million or 30 million, and Aubrey, coming back to your question, if you want to partner with 3 million or 30 million farmers and provide them financing, you need capital. You need access to deep and liquid capital markets. And I think historically, that sort of capital, that deep and liquid capital, just hasn't been there for lending to small-scale farmers. I think we're really fortunate to have partners like the United States Development Finance Corporation and others who see the opportunity that if we can take our machine learning technology, which allows us to assess the credit risk of farmers, and pair it with their access to capital, then we can partner with farmers to give them the financial resources that they need to invest and to grow their businesses. And so I'd really echo what Niraj said. I think we're on a 10 or 20-year journey towards a place where we can float a bond in the public markets and raise that capital for on-lending to small-scale farmers. But in the near term, I think that the role of governments, the role of development finance institutions, the role of private lenders is going to be huge in thinking about how do we rapidly scale up these innovations that are really working, like Apollo and Apricure, and put financial muscle behind them.
Yeah, and one of our recommendations is that DFIs do more on-lending through ag tech platforms rather than the traditional just on-lending through banks. But Cameron, I want to come to you. I mean, MCC has historically worked pretty aggressively across African markets, largest portfolio, and you've done a lot of supporting of infrastructure writ large, physical infrastructure, and beginning to think more on digital infrastructure. How do you see this playing and interacting in the agricultural sector so that these type of companies can continue to grow?
Well, thank you for that. Let me join others in thanking Atlantic Council for hosting us today. Fatima, Aubrey, congratulations on the report and getting that out there. So MCC, as folks know, is one of the tools in the US government toolkit, and we focus on one thing, and that's reducing poverty through economic growth. And as a part of that, we recognize that investments in agriculture can be more than twice as effective at reducing poverty as investments in other sectors. Now, this is working with our partner governments to identify the binding constraints to growth in their countries. What are the root causes around then implementing structural change? And then how do we work with them to implement the solutions that they pick? And I think country ownership is an important part of the model. So as you reference, right, I think many folks would associate us with the hard infrastructure.
Yeah,
right?
roads.
Yes, roads, bridges, which of course is facilitating market access, right? Which is a key part. I mean, frankly, we can solve one part of the problem in getting finance, but if you can't get goods to market, frankly, what was the point, right? So we play a critical role in that, right? We're doing that on the continent. That's Malawi. It's a key piece of the Mozambique program that we're about to sign on Thursday, and very excited to do that. But it's not just that hard infrastructure. There are other areas, some of the areas that our previous speakers, the special envoys, spoke about. So just quickly, whether that was reform in land tenure in Morocco, which was a critical issue. Let's use the special envoy's country of Niger, where we've made investments in agriculture, or in irrigation, but including mapping of aquifers and underground resources in Niger and how to utilize that, tackling the fertilizer sector and providing reform there, including incentivizing the private sector to provide, and then through the use of mobile points to get vouchers directly in the hands of farmers to be able to capitalize on the reform in the fertilizer sector. Maybe just one last example on the technology space. In Lesotho, post-harvest loss is a significant issue, as it is in many countries. So we're looking to launch a cold chain challenge, where we will challenge the private sectors and others to come up with innovative use of technology to address this, including in areas that don't have access to grid technology or certainly don't have reliable power, and how we're going to address that issue. I could speak more, but maybe let me stop there, recognizing where we are.
And Fatima, I want to bring you in on this in two ways to build on what Cameron was sharing about the potential, and Dr. Fowler and Prime Minister Mayaki mentioned as well, the potential to reduce poverty. And Dr. Fowler potentially, he specifically pointed out the role of women. And I know that you had a passion of that in the report. So thoughts on innovations to reach women. And secondly, the points on fertilizer. You're sitting in Morocco. OCP is one of the world's greatest players in fertilizer, and I know they've done a ton in terms of mapping soil across the continent to understand a smart approach to fertilizer. So maybe you can speak to those issues that both appear in the report. And again, it was such a pleasure collaborating with you on this.
Pleasure is mine. So before going into details, I would like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk here and to speak about a very important sector for us in Africa, in Morocco and in Africa. I think before jumping into the women and youth and the fertilizer issues, I would like to add just one more thoughts about technology and agritech. We know that in the reports we try to add technologies from a specific point of view, but I join my voice to the last panelist who spoke about other technologies that are very important for the agricultural sector, such as infrastructure and others, because we know that agriculture plays a very important role in terms of assuring food security, but also in terms as it plays also a role as an engine for the economy, because it contributes actively to the value added and the labor markets, which makes it very important. That's why we should look at how should we improve agriculture in Africa, and there are two ways to do this. Either we use more inputs to improve production, which is not sustainable because we know that resources are limited, or we use technology, which is very important because it allows us to manage resources that are limited and also increase productivity. So productivity is not just a matter of technology is not just a matter of using digitalization or numerical objects, but also trying to use tools or other techniques that allows us to improve productivity, which is very important for the agricultural sector, specifically in Africa. Regarding the women and the youth point of view or issue, we know that women play a pivotal role in African agriculture because it contributes to almost 50% of the labor market in Africa, and they also contribute to 60 to 80% of the total food production, which makes them a very important which makes them play a very important role in terms of food production and also in terms of improving productivity. Helping these vulnerable people that are women and youth people could be a very good thing because they are the future of Africa, of agriculture in Africa, and they contribute a lot and actively to improve to produce this value added and also this food that are consumed and even is exported toward other continents. So the inclusion of this specific part of the population is very important for the African agricultural sector. Given the use of the fertilizer, as you know, as I explained, the use of technology is not just about using very specific or high-tech tools. It's also providing the adequate inputs for the adequate for a specific or a local context. We know in Africa there is a high land degradation due to climate change, due to overuse of inputs in some regions or in some specific areas. That's why we should take into consideration the needs that are observed in the local context, and we at African we understand that we need a very local solution for local problems. That's why we tried in Morocco, for example, for the specific example of OCP, we tried to produce customized fertilizers that are adapted for the local context and that answers the needs of the soil quality in Africa. And this is a very important technology to take into consideration because we need this in other inputs. As we know, technologies are all invented in other countries and imported in Africa, which make them sometimes not suitable for this African context. But when we have innovation in the local area or context, we have most effective solutions that work in the ground. And finally, just to end my presentation, I would like to thank Aubrey for giving the methodology that has been used for the report, because yes, it's very important to point out the successful stories that has been created in Africa, and also it's very important to look to other experiences such as the Indian experience, from which we can get inspired to create our own story and our own green revolution.
Well, thank you, Fatima. It's really a pleasure, and I'm glad you brought up some important points about women. And so I would love to hear just maybe from Eli, and Apollo, do you have any specific innovations to reach female or farmers or the youth? I mean, despite Africa's youth bulge, many farming regions are short on labor, as many have moved to the cities. So just curious of whether you've had any innovations in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're very proud that women and youth are the engine of Apollo. 51% of our customers are women, and we think that is both something that we're proud of, but also should be table stakes. I mean, as Fatima said, women are 50% of the labor force, and so the idea that that somehow less than 50% of women would be Apollo customers, I think would be a shame. And so we think that our female customers are the most important engine of our growth. And I think we've been able to really, from first principles, design a financial solution that addresses some of the core issues that have historically locked women out of being able to borrow. And so I think it's a more detailed conversation, but I think I'd highlight a few things. For example, often a bank might ask for collateral from land or just a banking, and those might be things that have locked people out from borrowing. And so we're able to start from scratch and understand the farmer and their farm and make an underwriting decision on the basis of the machine learning technology that we can bring to bear on that problem. And that allows us to assess people for who they are, their potential, and their potential as farmers. And so I think that's allowed us to really have quite a different picture in terms of adoption of female customers than you might otherwise see in other markets or other businesses.
Yeah, so just a closing question to Niraj and then Eli, and then Cameron can wrap it up on potential partnerships of the future. But what would it take? I mean, you're both in 2 countries right now, Kenya as a base, Zambia, Uganda. What would it take to go to 2, 3, 4 more countries? I assume that building out, it's not so easy as a just pure fintech play to move to new countries. So would love to hear how that growth could be supported. Maybe Niraj, we'll start with you.
Sure. So the digitization work, to get to what we've seen is we need to get to about 25% of all agro retailers in the country for the network effects to kick in, for local banks, et cetera, to really get excited about working through the platform that we're building. On average, we've done some numbers around this. On average, it costs us about $1 million to $1.5 million to digitize that 25%.
So is it just financial?
By and large, because the technology is largely built, there's a bit of modification to be done. So that's certainly one piece. The second piece is, as we go into new countries, in Kenya, we've ended up having to build a lot of the distribution infrastructure ourselves. In Uganda, we've been able to partner because we have a system that works. And so partnerships with local distributors, local input suppliers, local banks who want to use our platform to reach the smallholder farmers is absolutely critical. So those are the 2 big things. And getting to 2 countries, we can do 2 countries at a time already. So gives you a sense of the pace that we can move at.
Eli.
I think, Aubrey, I'd highlight just sort of a core dichotomy and challenge that we have to balance in operating our business. So on one side, we've raised a fair amount of private equity capital. So we've been fortunate to raise more than $50 million to bring to bear on this problem from investors. And so to be candid, those investors are telling us, go a bit slower, aim for profitability sooner, don't take undue risks. On the other side, we have sort of a multi-layered potential humanitarian crisis. We have a spike in the price of fertilizer. We have climate change and the droughts it's brought. We have crises in the price of other core commodities that farmers need. And so I think as our leadership team goes forward, we're trying to figure out how do we strike this balance between our investors on one side telling us to, of course, to grow fast and to get big, but to be cautious. And on the other side, I think to try and meet this humanitarian challenge with the sort of preemptive humanitarian action that would put us in a position to help farmers produce more before we see humanitarian crisis that requires us to bring food in. And so I think that there's a huge opportunity for action by governments, for action by development finance institutions to help us bridge that gap and expand more quickly into this course of this challenge while still sort of managing the needs of our investors who've also been integral on this journey and giving us the capital that we've needed to scale.
No, I think that, and that tees up. I mean, Cameron, we're talking about innovations and partnership. You mentioned the Lesotho kind of cold chain challenge, but how does MCC think about engaging with innovative companies, and how have you evolved in thinking about partnerships in the region?
Yeah, thanks for that. Because our thinking has evolved, and I think we recognize that while our country partners, right, are truly our partners in the program, we need to bring in other partners. We need to bring in other folks and be strategic about that. That they can bring their expertise, and whether it's private sector or frankly other international organizations that may be working in country, how to leverage that work, how to work then bring in the others in co-creation of the programs to see that they have the impacts that ultimately all of us want to see. So just quickly, I referenced the Mozambique program. On Thursday, there's a coastal livelihoods restoration part of that program, which leverage partners and use co-design to focus on coastlines, right? Restoration, fisheries protection, which of course is also part of this conversation, very much so, right? And so we're excited about that and see that as another modality that we can better leverage going forward. In our programs.
and your other U.S. government colleagues, USAID, DFC, we've heard today
Absolutely.
on this stage have been game changing. Well, this is a conversation we could have for much, much longer. We hoped to at least begin the ball rolling with the launch of the report today and this conversation. And we are around. I hope that you will all join for lunch that's coming right after this. And so join me in thanking my panel and thanking both Fatima and Eli from joining much later in their evening. And then we will close today. So thank you again for joining the Africa Center's discussion as part of the Atlantic Council in New York. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.